getting high has been something humans have always done, and as the modern world gets more stressful, we have more resources, we in the richer countries appear to be getting more high more often. This is a conversation with Dr. William Fanagrossi, who sometimes is contracted by the federal government to identify the contents of new drugs that appear. They raid a bodega and there's some thing that people are buying, and he breaks down, well, a big danger is now with all the scientific papers being on the web. Anytime someone makes any compound in any lab, it's uploaded, and the factories in China and Eastern Europe can start pumping it out without knowing. These are things that haven't been tested on humans. That's why you can see all these prison videos of people going crazy on K2 spice, because each batch, or not each batch, but you know, there's thousands of endocannabinoids, which is what that spice is that exists in your brain and that have been synthesized, and they don't know the impact of them. He went down to Brazil and studied the Union Vegetal. It's the vegetable church. It's a church that sees its higher power as being contained in the plants that come together to form the ayahuasca brew. So what is the future of drugs? Well, this was recorded in 2016, and we had no idea the fentanyl storm was coming, so it's really hard to foresee. But though he did say, I said, what do you see as the future? And he said, well, probably the same stuff that's been popular will be popular 50 years from now. And fentanyl is an old drug that resurfaced. I do worry, though, like if all these drugs that are 100, 120, 50 years old, yayo, Mizeth, the odds that someone, especially now with AI, is gonna create some, there's no new drugs have really come out in a long, like MDMA seems like it was the last major new drug, which came out in 80 or maybe late 70s. I mean, what if something was as addictive as H, but it was like a stimulant too? I don't know. I mean, we'll see. But I want to tell you about one interesting thing to prep you for when they talk about these ayahuasca experiences. So, the belief in God in the United States has declined precipitously. But obviously humans need something to believe in, and judging by the amount of content, even just on YouTube, about people's ayahuasca, and I went to South America and did DMT and this, and it changed my life. In 1962, there was something called the Good Friday experiment. It's actually one of the things that made Timothy Leary famous. It got him fired from Harvard. They got a bunch of divinity students, students in theology studying to become priests. So they figured they were predisposed to believe in mystical experiences. Some got a placebo, which was niacin. Some got psilocybin mushrooms. And they described having what to them were profound religious experiences, because psilocybin does make you feel very different. And they were predisposed to believe in mystical experiences because they were already divinity students. And these beliefs were persistent. And even 20 years later, when they asked these guys about it, they thought, oh no, that was a real religious experience. So to some extent, some of us have replaced belief in God with belief in that, DMT and ayahuasca and psilocybin are special drugs, and the high effect is actually revealing a secret truth, which I think is interesting. I mean, it's clearly an analog for God that people no longer believe in. And leave you with this, and I'll let the interview start. One of the professors told me, amongst college professors that are chemists, or just people involved in the drug research and all that, their drug of choice is ketamine. And he said when I interviewed them, they had just had to do an intervention on some of their buddies, some 60-year-old, highly notable tenured professor at a major university about his ketamine use. Ketamine is a dissociative, which PCP also is. So a drug very similar to Sherm is what's popular amongst those most highly educated. So we'll get into the interview. Al Prophet, American Dope.
A heck of a lot of these drugs of abuse that I've been talking about, that are these emerging drugs, they weren't created by drug dealers in the US. They weren't created by large chemical houses in China. They were created by academic chemists here in the US and in Europe. Well, not all, a heck of a lot of these synthetic cannabinoids were all synthesized by one guy that was at Clemson University, and he was making them to learn more about the endocannabinoid system in the brain. So THC, for example, binds to the CB1 and the CB2 receptor. In pharmacology, we don't like it when drugs bind lots of different things. We like to get selective ones and say, we just want to study this one receptor. So that's what he wanted to do. He made hundreds and hundreds of compounds that would bind just this one or just that one. Some of them were more potent than others. Some of them were more effective than others. With the internet age, people were able to now get access to the articles that he wrote for chemical abstracts, for example, where he details exactly what his synthesis was. Anybody with a lab could make it, and now they do. There are people in Europe, in Asia, that set up alerts with PubMed, one of the big databases for these papers. So when a chemist that's working with, let's say, the dopamine system, whenever this person publishes in chemical abstracts, it will just automatically send it to their email. They'll wake up in the morning, check their email, and say, oh, here's a new drug for us to make. And they just bank them on the shelves. And by the time the current compounds are made illegal, regulated, and detectable, they throw all those away, move the next batch up, and go again. So there's almost an unending supply. And this is kind of similar to what you were asking about, like if the CIA were to ask about something, right? I mean, these academic chemists, this is how they make a living. This is what they do. If you make a new synthesis, you have to publish it or it doesn't exist. But if you publish it, somebody's going to make it, and that drug's going to kill somebody eventually. So what do? It's one of the main sort of tenets of pharmacology, right, is that drugs aren't doing things to your brain that wouldn't happen if there were no drugs. They're just kind of activating things that are there for other reasons. So, you know, it's not the case, and you hear this sometimes from some of the crunchier marijuana proponents that, God put these receptors in our brains so that we could smoke weed, right? And that's absolutely not true. The reason those receptors are there is because you have endocannabinoids right now that are mediating all sorts of processes within your brain. So you've got a compound called anandamide, you've got 2-arachidonyl glycerol. Those are both endogenous cannabinoids. And what happens is THC in marijuana binds to the same receptors that those things do. JWH018 in K2 spice binds to the same receptors those things do. So, and that's how all drugs of abuse work. They get into your blood, they somehow, either you eat them, you snort them, you inject them, you smoke them, they get from the blood up into the brain, and they stick to receptors that are physically compatible with their chemical structure. They just bind. And so that's what happens. That's what it's there for. So, the fact that you have religion in basically every culture in the world probably means you've got some brain stuff that evolved specifically to mediate that. I don't see any reason you couldn't design drugs to go in there and poke at those same sorts of structures and those same pathways, turn them on, turn them off, however you want to manipulate them. Even as somebody that works with these things every day, it's still kind of an impressive notion to me that these tiny amounts, a milligram of some white powder, can get into your body and literally change your life, provoke some kind of internal experience that lasts a couple of hours, but you come out of it a different person. And your family knows it, you know it, your friends know it. That's pretty incredible to me. So, the idea that the idea that anything that can do that would just be sort of willy-nilly used and thrown around and, oh, here, take this. That's crazy to me. That just seems like a bad idea. I think what it also did, and that we don't really pay enough attention to, is it really did have some therapeutic usefulness for kind of a lot of people. The drugs themselves weren't the best, but we can make better ones. And, I think that's true for all medicine. So if you go back even to depression 30 or 40 years ago, the drugs that were available were no good. The drugs that we have now aren't a heck of a lot better. They're safer. They don't work better necessarily. But, the drugs that we had back then, they were dangerous drugs.
They didn't work.
And they didn't work. If you took too much, you could die. That's not really the case anymore. So, there's this movement to kind of make things better, to sort of learn more about the pathophysiology of what's going on and how to fix it. So that can kind of help us with that. I am a true believer in some of these compounds that, these drugs that we think about as drugs of abuse, because that's the setting where they're used. I do believe that a heck of a lot of them have clinical utility. That being said, they need to be formulated correctly. They need to be used in sort of precise dosing regimens. They need to be used under clinical care. Anything.
That'd be drugs like ayahuasca, MDMA, DMT, psilocybin, LSD.
So I don't think any of those drugs will ever be given to a human as a medicine. So
Can you say that?
Yeah. So I don't think MDMA, LSD, psilocybin will ever be a medicine. There's just too much baggage with those compounds, right? It's just not going to happen. What I do think is likely to happen is a chemical cousin of any one of those drugs that is different enough structurally that it maintains the therapeutic effects that we want, but maybe reduces some of the psychoactive effects, some of these other off-target effects. In the case of some of these drugs, with the hallucinogens, for example, a lot of them produce pretty gnarly GI distress and diarrhea when people take those. It doesn't have to. There's no reason we couldn't engineer that out of a molecule the same way we would engineer hypertension kind of effects out of a pain medication. By sort of treating some of these things as unwanted side effects and enlisting chemists to try to get rid of them but maintain the therapeutic effects, I do believe that we will come up with compounds that are related to drugs of abuse with notorious pasts, but we will be smart about it. We'll name them things that don't remind you of drugs of abuse. We'll put them into capsules with extended releases and things like that, like we do with all kinds of medications now. And most people that take them won't even really know that this is a drug that's related to MDMA, for example. Yeah, so we have DMT in our bodies now because it is both a precursor, which means it's on the way to something else, as well as a breakdown product of other things that are in your body.
Doesn't mean God put it there.
It doesn't mean that at all. And in fact, this is the reason why when you mentioned ayahuasca earlier, ayahuasca is interesting because it's not just DMT, right? In order to make this stuff active when you drink it, they have to combine different plants. If you just drink DMT, nothing will happen. DMT is almost immediately attacked in your body by other enzymes that turn it into something else or break it down into its constituent parts. So instead, in order for that to be active, you have to have something that's an inhibitor of an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, an MAO inhibitor. And that's what's in like this yahe tea and stuff like that, is different plants. It's pretty incredible to me that they figured that out, but they did. That's also why some of these analogs of DMT aren't just DMT. They have other bits attached to them that make them resistant to this immediate breakdown by that monoamine oxidase. But as far as the sort of commonality of the hallucinogen experience, that is no more surprising to me than the commonality of saying, oh shit, when you stub your toe, right? I mean, you've got a you've got physiology that has evolved over many, many years. If you believe in this stuff, you believe we have common ancestors, we're not that different from each other. If you stub your toe, grab a dude from any continent, any society you want, and have him stub his toe on something. He's not going to like it. He's going to shout. It's going to be painful. We have a commonality of experience with all drugs. When we take aspirin, our headaches go away. When we take opioids, we become analgesic, we become slow, we become sleepy, right? This idea that the hallucinogen drug experience is tapping into some, universal mystical truth, to me is bananas. That's the drug effect. That's what it does, right? That's what those systems in your brain do, and we turn them on with these drugs. And the systems that I have for it aren't different from what you have, aren't different from what anybody would have anywhere in the world, if you believe in sort of evolution of the species. So, this idea that we tend to see the same thing is no crazier than saying, when we take amphetamine, our hearts beat faster and we want to jump around. It's just the drug effect.
That's what it does.
Yeah, that's what our physiology is set up to be responsive to. And, a good example, and those are what's called polymorphic, which means they can vary from individual to individual. So a really good example is the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, which Asians are deficient in. And that's why when they drink, not very much, they get flushed, they tend to get drunk very easily. And, it's there. That's their physiology. My people from Europe that, grew up in the bog with no sunlight, we can drink tremendous amounts of ethanol before we get this kind of toxicity. Milk is another example. So, there's this idea, maybe it's the case that African Americans have some enzyme that either metabolizes meth into something nasty that makes them not like it, or doesn't metabolize it as fast, so every dose they take is kind of like an overdose. What's the difference? I don't think anybody knows. Yeah, or it has less effect, or what could be going on. Those are questions that I think are just legit scientific questions. People don't necessarily like to ask them because it kind of gets you into this uncomfortable territory of, why do these people take all these drugs whereas these people don't? And, the implication is what's wrong with these people, right? So we don't necessarily like to phrase it that way. We like to find other ways to kind of come at it. But, I think those are real things that could be there. I don't believe for a second that a black guy that takes cocaine is any more resistant to a bullet than a black guy that doesn't take cocaine, right? So there are obviously uses of this stuff that are being done for the benefit of other people. But, in terms of why is drug X used in this population but not so much in that population, that's a damn interesting question, I think.
Also, we have Dr. Charles Grove talking about another thing that's gotten here in LA. Rich people are having ayahuasca ceremonies in their home. Ayahuasca is extremely powerful. It's DMT. And he went down to Brazil and studied the Union Vegetal. It's the vegetable church. It's a church that sees its higher power as being contained in the plants that come together to form the ayahuasca brew.
Yeah, so in the early 90s, with my colleagues Dennis McKenna and Joyce Calloway,
You worked with Dennis McKenna.
and Brazilian colleagues, we conducted what became known as the Ayahuasca Project in Brazil, working with members of the União Vegetal, a Brazilian syncretic church which has been granted approval since the late 80s to utilize ayahuasca within the context of their religious ceremonies. We essentially conducted out in the rainforest outside of Manaus in Brazil, a phase 1 study looking at the range of physiological effects and psychological effects, and found that amongst our subject population, all of whom had been members of the UDV for at least 10 years and participated in twice monthly religious ceremonies using ayahuasca as a psychoactive sacrament, that their physiological and psychological health were very strong, that indeed they had, many of them, improved psychological functioning from the time predating their introduction to the ayahuasca church and regular ayahuasca use. And we were able to establish a very strong safety profile for them. Later in the early 2000s, with my colleague Marlene Dopkin de Rios and some, again, Brazilian colleagues, we did a thorough assessment of adolescent children of Brazilians who belonged to the UDV, whose adolescent children had participated in family sessions where ayahuasca was the psychoactive sacrament, and we established that these young people,
How young?
teenagers, post-pubertal, they all had strong psychological health, good function, highly functional young people. We had a non-ayahuasca exposed control group, and we found the only difference between the two groups was the kids from the ayahuasca religion families who had participated in ceremonies themselves were far less likely to have experimented with alcohol or other substances. Some of these kids were exposed in utero. The women of the UDV often participate in ceremonies while pregnant. Some will take a small amount of ayahuasca during actual labor and delivery. I attended baptisms where babies were administered with an eyedropper, 1 or 2 drops of ayahuasca on their tongue.
Would that give an effect?
No, not really. No. It creates.
It's symbolic.
It's symbolic, and children are not exposed to ayahuasca until they reach puberty, when they're given the choice of participating in family sessions with their parents and grandparents.
So, and you can't really say that as long as it's given properly that there's any negative.
Within the context of the UDV, and granted, they monitor their congregation very, very carefully, both medically and psychologically. It seems to be very well tolerated, and we saw no adverse outcomes that could be attributed to the ayahuasca.
How widespread is ayahuasca usage in
Brazil? Well, in Brazil, the UDV at this point in time probably has 15,000 members. They have branches in the United States, but probably constituting no more than a couple hundred people in a few cities. There was a big...
Is it legal here?
Well, there was a case that went to federal court in the early 2000s. I was actually an expert medical witness in federal court in New Mexico. The UDV there was had their ayahuasca taken by agents of the DEA, and they continued to hold their ceremonies, but using water as their sacrament. But they also retained the services of a very, very expert attorney, Nancy Hollander, who's really an outstanding attorney, who put together an excellent case that went to federal court. I was the expert medical witness. I was actually on the witness stand for 6 hours over 2 days. The case was heard over 2 weeks, at the end of which the federal judge, who was a conservative Republican, ruled to support the UDV's freedom of religion to take their ayahuasca. It was appealed by the U.S. Justice Department. It went to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver, where first a panel heard the case and ruled 2-1 to uphold the federal judge's verdict. It was then appealed to the full circuit court, which ruled 9-5, again to support the UDV's freedom of religion rights. It was then appealed by the U.S. Justice Department to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they ruled in 2006 unanimously that the UDV should have their freedom of religion rights protected. So they're within the UDV, they're allowed to take ayahuasca. Now, granted, this is only a couple hundred people.
Could I go join the UDV?
No, you would need a special invitation. You can't just attend a ceremony. Now, on the other hand, there's another Brazilian church, the Santo Daime, which has far more members. It's while the UDV has a very tight hierarchy and tight control over their process, the Daime appears to be somewhat looser. They established a big center in Oregon, which took their case to the state courts, and they were supported in the state court. So the UDV had federal court support, whereas the Daime had state court in Oregon. So different levels of support, but within those two religions, members will make the case that they have sanction. And the Daime is more open to individuals wanting to have an experience. So ayahuasca tourism it's not a phenomenon in Brazil. Mostly it's occurring in Peru, where retreat centers exist, where North Americans and Europeans are going down in increasing number to have experiences. Some of the facilitators at particular retreat centers are highly skilled. Many of them come from a long lineage of ayahuasqueros, fathers or mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers who are in this line of healing. And it comes from a mestizo healing tradition within Peru. There are other facilitators who see an opportunity for profit.
This has just been passed down for thousands of years.
Yeah, it has passed down for many, many generations, absolutely. So, but other centers are staffed by individuals with far less training, far less ability, and that's where problems can arise. So that's problem.
There's been some deaths.
There have been a few deaths, a couple under mysterious circumstances, not clear what happened, but again, they appear to be centers where you don't have the level of expertise and knowledge that you do in other settings there.
So would you say that ayahuasca, psilocybin, and even MDMA usage is something that a mentally healthy person in the proper setting is something that would be beneficial to their life?
There is that potential, but again, it's set and setting is critical. Who that individual is, what the reason for having this experience is, what their underlying vulnerabilities are, and then the setting, where they take it, who they take it with, how protected is it. These all come into play, but there is a potential to have a very, very valuable, even transformative experience. Absolutely. So when I was in Brazil, in Manaus, conducting our study in 1993, our hosts in the UDV, whom we were working with quite intimately and who were really assisting us quite a bit in the collection of our data, because the UDV had a strong belief in science. They believed that science would prove, and they believed in fair, objective science, but they were very confident that the science of ayahuasca would provide a very favorable bill of health, which in the end we found. But they invited myself and my colleagues, Dennis McKenna, Jason Calloway, a few others who were with us, to attend their ceremonies. So here we were faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, we could say, no, we don't do that, or we could figure, well, what a great opportunity to better understand how this religion functions and how ayahuasca is utilized. Also, the curiosity factor we all had, and also the perception that to turn down the offer of our very, very hospitable hosts would be somewhat insulting to them. And of course, for all of those reasons stated, we participated in or joined the ceremony. So I'll tell you a couple of stories, which is, the first is, at our first session that we attended, the way the UDV structures their ceremonies is that individuals are given a cup of ayahuasca. They hold that cup until everyone has their cup, and then the maestri, the minister, provides an incantation, a prayer over the ayahuasca, really blessing it. Everyone drinks in unison, and people sit down for a period of time. Some very pleasant music is played on a sound system. Then the maestri will sing a religious song called a shamata, often odes to the beauties of nature, or songs about the stories of the founders, actual founders, mythological founders of their religion. And then congregants will ask for permission to sing, always singing by just one individual, not collectively. The maestri will then give a sermon or a talk which provides instructive lessons, and often talking about the need to behave in a proper manner out in the world, to be responsible, to be ethical, to be good spouses, to be good parents to their kids, to be good to their own parents, be good employers, be good employees, always be as responsible as possible. And then often congregants will raise their hand and ask for permission to speak. So this night, there's a very active dialogue back and forth between the maestri and some individuals in the congregation. And my Portuguese was somewhat limited. I was having trouble following the nature of the dialogue, so I turned to the woman who was interpreting for me, and she had lapsed off into silence. So I asked her, what are they saying? What are they talking about? Because I felt I really needed to understand this because it would help me better understand how this whole process works. He said, well, what they are saying is how important it is that if you say you're going to be someplace at a certain time, you be there. And I thought, oh, this is extraordinary. Here I am in South America where punctuality is not always, practiced. And
job training.
Yeah, so it's people are with hallucinogens are in a hyper-suggestible state. So here they're being given messages to how to be a better person, how to be more responsible, how to function more effectively out in the world, how to be a more ethical person. And these individuals had taken it to heart and had become part of their very fabric, their fiber, and they had evolved, they had transformed. And some of these individuals who started out leading very dissolute, disreputable lives, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, sociopathic behaviors, had gotten their act together, had maintained sobriety for years, had become pillars of the community, were highly respected within the community, the UDV community and the outside community. So I thought this was a very, very instructive lesson. So I'll give you another story, which was at another in Manaus, very, very powerful brew. And everyone this is at a preparo, where the ayahuasca is prepared from the two plants, Banisteriopsis caapi, a woody vine, and Psychotria viridis, a leaf from a plant. The Psychotria contains DMT. The Banisteriopsis contains harmala alkaloids. When either is taken separately by mouth, nothing happens. But when taken together, there's a synergistic effect, and it induces a powerful 3 to 4 hour visionary state. So it was a very powerful experience, at the end of which I was sitting in my chair just looking around at these multi-family systems, parents with their children, with the grandparents, and it was the most remarkably harmonious setting. And I was just really, really struck by just how peaceful it was, the harmony, the collective feelings of regard and even love for one another.
A good example of why it's difficult to study drugs in humans is that we live for a long time, first of all, and by the time we can get you into the lab, you have a very complex and individual history that includes not just sort of your upbringing, your schooling, your job history, your personality, but also your drug history. So, one of the things that we know in pharmacology is that drug effects can change over time with repeated drug administration. This is why the first time you had a little bit of alcohol, you got very drunk, and now you have to drink much more alcohol. You develop tolerance, for example. And so, by the time you can get people into a study, they're all very, very different from each other. So there were attempts early on when MDMA was sort of the big drug during kind of the height of rave culture in the US to study some of its effects on learning and cognition. We knew from animal studies that repeated high doses of this stuff could produce some persistent changes in the brain that were interpreted by some as toxicity. You can't bring humans in and give them tons of drugs, but you can bring in humans that will tell you they've used drugs a ton already. So that was what was attempted to do. The problem was when you try to bring in people that have used a lot of ecstasy, you wind up with people that have used also a lot of cocaine and a lot of amphetamine and a lot of marijuana and alcohol and nicotine and everything else. So there were attempts made to identify people who were sort of sole users of MDMA. I think they allowed nicotine, I'm sure they allowed caffeine, they probably allowed some alcohol as well, but in terms of your sort of harder drugs of abuse, they couldn't have used cocaine, couldn't have used amphetamine, they had to have been MDMA users. Those people are difficult to identify. In order to get enough of them to do a study, They wound up having to fly people in from all over the U.S., and the people that they got turned out to not be a representative sample in many ways. So they were predominantly white, they were predominantly of high socioeconomic status, they were predominantly academically very well high achievers. They were in college. They had a high socioeconomic status. So these were people that had heard about ecstasy. These were in the fairly early days of the internet, but the World Wide Web was there, and they had searched for it. Ask Jeeves or something like that, probably, and learned about it, right? And learned about it, and were interested in using it safely. So they would use it once or twice a month at raves. And when you then study these people, particularly if you're interested in learning and cognition, you give them tests, you give them cognitive tests, and they do really, really well. So when you bring them in and you study them, and then you compare them to a local population of representative people, the ecstasy users did much better. And because they weren't a representative population. They came from a completely different place. So, it was a pain in the neck to then have to bring in high achievers to compare. I tell the students this all the time. There's no reason to do worse than a C in any pharmacology class, because if you can't work dose into the answer in some way, you're just not thinking enough, right? So, that's the fundamental issue in pharmacology is what's the dose. So if you have somebody that takes MDMA once a year for 50 years, I guarantee you that person's indistinguishable from the healthiest controls you could find. Somebody that does it 50 times in 1 year, that's a different story, right? They may be very different. But it also depends when you catch them. If they did it 50 times in 1997 and you studied them in 1998, they may be a little goofy looking. But if we studied them now in 2016, they may have recovered function quite a bit, if not completely. Scientists don't typically do those studies that take 20 years to complete, right? You get a grant funded for 5 years at best. You need to submit a progress report every year. If you say, well, we got some people and studied them and we'll tell you in 20 years what happened, you can forget about ever renewing that grant. You're not going to publish on it. So, we can kind of only do what we're able to, and that's probably not a study that anybody's really able to do. We have some of these larger survey studies that are done by the government. So we have the, what is it called? The NSDUH, the National Survey of Drug Use, and then H something. I don't know what it is. But, we have several of these things, and they study kids as early as 8th grade, I think, and they go through high school, but they typically don't continue to follow them into college and into adulthood. And it's not even that they follow the same person. I believe the data is all de-identified. So you only know that, like, in 8th grade, 10% of them had marijuana, but by the time they were at the end of high school, that had gone up to 23%.
What does that mean?
Yeah, right. And it's the best antidepressant we have right now. You can give it to people that are way up at the top of a depression scale, and in 4 hours, they're cured. They go back into being depressed in 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh, in 2 to 3 weeks?
Yeah, but you're talking from one injection, right? You're talking one injection. Yeah. And,
But ketamine is one of those drugs that has a very close overdose window, right?
No, ketamine is almost impossible to kill yourself with. In fact, that's one of the really good things about it, is that you probably will never see enough ketamine to kill a person. You'll see enough to have them just rocked and incapacitated for days, but they will not die. And in fact, that's why it's so useful in surgeries with veterinary anesthesia, for example, is that, it's used, we put horses down with it, you put monkeys, rats, mice in a research setting, we use ketamine anesthesia. You don't have to worry about overdose.
Sleep a little longer.
Yep, exactly. They just sleep a little bit longer. So, it's a critical medicine.
Talk about opioids.
So, and the whole idea of opioids being necessary therapeutics, they're the best analgesic medicines we have. We don't have anything better. But also having all kinds of problems associated with them in terms of drugs of abuse. And not just in terms of abuse. Doctors will tell you, if you ask them anonymously in surveys, that they fairly routinely kill people with opioids, and they know that they're doing it. So, you know, one of the big issues, and like I was talking about earlier with tolerance to drugs, is let me kind of backtrack and clean that up a little bit. Nobody becomes tolerant to drugs. You become tolerant to drug effects. So drugs do 100 things all at once within the body. And some of those things you can lose sensitivity to much faster than other things. So the main problem with the opioids in a clinical setting, so not in a drug abuse setting, but in the hospital, is that you very rapidly develop tolerance to the analgesic effects, which means that you have to constantly escalate the dose in order to manage the pain of somebody who has a terminal painful condition like bone cancer or something like that. On the other hand, another thing that opioids do is they suppress the respiratory centers in the brain. And that's what kills you when you overdose, is respiratory depression. Tolerance to respiratory depressant effects develops very slowly. So over time, you can have a drug where the respiratory depressant dose is way up here and the analgesic effect is here. But every day, that analgesic dose is getting closer and closer until eventually physicians know that if I control this person's pain adequately, she will die. But they give the dose anyway, because what are they going to do? I mean, when a person is in a situation of palliative care, we can't cure them. All we can do is make them comfortable. We very often kill people with the pain medications. In the drug abuse world, you have that exact same thing. Because the euphoric effects, you become tolerant to that as well. So you escalate your dose to try to maintain that euphoria. And every time you do, you're getting closer and closer to that dose that will eventually kill you by respiratory depression. One of the huge goals in medicinal chemistry for years has been to make some kind of an opioid analog that maintains the analgesic effects without the respiratory depressant effects. The person that does that will win a Nobel Prize, absolutely. I have no doubt of that whatsoever. But you know, you can also imagine doing more than that. So maintaining the analgesic effects without the euphoria. So now not only...
Euphoria bad?
Well, it's bad because that's why people abuse it, right? So if you want a pain medication, that, you know, has no... So you asked about prescription opioids, right? Killing more people than ever. It's not the people that have the prescription that are killing themselves with them, right? It's you go to grandma's house and you steal her pain meds. If the pain meds didn't produce euphoria, there would be no reason for the kids to be stealing them, right? So it's not that euphoria is bad. It's that that's why they're abused. And so if you can make some kind of an abuse deterrent formulation, you would save lives, right? So, you know, this is work that's ongoing right now in medicinal chemistry and also in pharmacology, like you and I were talking about before, where receptors can signal in different ways. It turns out that the analgesic effects of, let's say, morphine come through signaling pathway A, but respiratory depression and tolerance are from a different pathway. So if we could make an analog that stabilizes the receptor in this conformation, that it signals through the pathway we want, but doesn't signal through this one, you could get that. So this is sort of an intersection between pharmacologists better understanding how these drugs work at the receptor level and chemists that can just make lots and lots of new drugs for us to test. Most of them will be garbage. Some of them won't dissolve in water, which means it will be essentially unusable. Some of them will look fantastic in a test tube, and you'll be ready to call the hotel in Stockholm and book your hotel room for that Nobel Prize. But when you put it in an animal, some enzyme will come along and chop it up before it ever even gets to the brain. So, you know, it'll be a long quest, but people know what they're doing, and they're working really hard.
So looking forward, with the daily increase in computing power and the ability to store more data in the interconnectedness, the web, so what these compounds that were made to be tested in a test tube now, hundreds of thousands and millions of people are taking them. Mm-hmm. So there's effectively an infinite amount of compounds that can be made from a human standpoint.
Sure.
Trillions is infinity. What is in humans, we obviously are, you know, what's the meaning of life? We seek it in religion and family and all kind of things. What's the future of drug research, of humans taking drugs, of abusing drugs?
Sure.
You know, the bad and the good. What's it gonna look like in 50 years, if that's even imaginable?
Yeah, so in 50 years, I imagine that we will have many of the same drugs that we have now. Cocaine has been around for a really long time. So is ethanol. I don't see them going anywhere. People like them. I'm sure we will have new drugs. I think we will have much more information about drugs. I think that's part of what's really new. Not just being able to get the drugs themselves by ordering them off the internet, but to sort of know what you're getting into. So you can say, you know what, I want a drug that is going to give me LSD-like visuals with some amphetamine-like energy, but I want to be able to take it and be back to normal within 4 hours. You can find that sort of information now, and that was not the case before. Before it was, try some blues, right? Try some reds. That was all the information you had. What color is the pill? Now that's not the case anymore. I think as sort of medicine moves forward with personalized medicine and we start to know more about our own genetic makeup, our own liver enzyme profile, that information will probably become useful. You might be able to say, this is a drug that's not for you. Your body is just going to metabolize it. You're not going to get much of an effect. You're going to wind up spending $50 and not really getting a drug effect out of it. Instead, you'd be better served with this one. Or you might find ones that say, if you take this one, you're going to die. That acute toxicity I talked about before, where, right now I can't tell you who is going to have a dissected aorta from taking a stimulant because their blood pressure goes through the roof. Soon we will. So I think, people will have more information, and, those that have the means to access that information and have the brains to sort of act on it will be able to kind of design their own drug experiences much more finely than they are now. And I think that's probably going to be somewhat of a revolution. No, I don't think so. And that's why I said at the beginning that I think that most of the old standbys will still be around, right? I mean, there's a reason they've lasted this long. People were using morphine when they were building the pyramids, for crying out loud. So,
Or opium.
Morphine.
Well, I don't have to... Morphine?
Morphine is in the plant.
Okay, all right.
Yep.
That's what the active ingredient.
Yep, yeah. So, there were people that were taking drugs that we give to people in the hospital right now in BC times is a good way to think about it, right? There were mastodons walking around North America when people in Egypt were cutting, slicing the opioid poppy and using, the stuff that came out.
So it's fair to say that we've developed a symbiotic relationship with at least some drugs. Yeah. So they do, at least sometimes in some places, help us as a species and help us as individuals to survive.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so when I work with the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts and I talk about drugs with them, it's a thing they have to do every single year. And one of the things I always ask the younger kids is, what's the difference between a drug and a medicine? And they always say, well, drugs are bad, but medicines are good for you. And they're all drugs. That's what pharmacologists do. We work with drugs. We don't distinguish bad drugs and good drugs. There are drugs that we give to people that are absolutely poisons. But we give them in very controlled amounts in the right circumstances, and they save lives. So, I'm certainly not one of those people that's going to go out there and say drugs are bad, and we should never use them. They obviously have their place. And, I think what the future holds is figuring out how to preserve that relationship but minimize the harms that have been associated with some of the drugs that we have now. And, it's the same way as all technology improves over time. The first automobiles people drove were terrible. They got better, then they got dangerous. Then, we made them still better but less dangerous. And, we're moving into sort of self-driving cars. We're moving into hybrids. So they continue to get better and hopefully even less dangerous. And we try to do the same thing with drugs and medications. Yeah, or I think realistically you could probably do that kind of thing without having to spritz it into the entire blood, right? If you have these sorts of things throughout the brain, if you want to wake somebody up, we know where the sleep-wake circuit is in the brain. You only need to put the drug right there. right? The issue with a lot of drug side effects is that in order to get it into your body, most people want to just eat it, which means it goes to your gut, it gets absorbed, and it goes everywhere that you have blood. So, you know, this idea of kind of controlling where the drug is released is another pretty interesting issue right now in pharmacology. In terms of cancer pharmacology, there are people that package drugs in microbubbles that pop when they're exposed to certain sound frequencies. And so you administer it IV, and then you blast where the tumor is with those frequencies. So the drug is everywhere, but it's protected in these bubbles. And then you pop the bubbles at the level of the tumor. So, you know, chemotherapeutic drugs are horrible, right? They are murder. They kill cells. They kill everything they come into contact with. If you could get them to only go into the tumor, that's great. So, you know, we're working with this kind of stuff already, much less with sort of local circuits in the brain, but it's just a matter of time.